with you, designing for everyone and how accessibility makes you a better developer. I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Linda Okorie. I like to describe myself as the chief inserter into product spaces. So I've been a product engineer at Wise for 3 years now, and I'm not your stereotypical engineer. I didn't fall in love with coding and decided I wanted to do it for the rest of my life. I did fall in love with products though, and I was always amazed at how products went from nothing into something beautiful. And I decided that somehow I was going to find a way to put myself in that process of making products anyhow. So in my career, I have done UX design, I have done product design, I have done product management, and currently right now I am doing engineering. Just anything that gets me close to product. So I am a software engineer, specifically a front-end engineer, while leveraging my knowledge on product. So product engineer, that's how my role is described. And today we want to discuss about something which I have learned along my path in these different roles, which is accessibility. So before I dive into it, I always like to set the stage on why it matters. Accessibility is like a keyword, a pop word that you hear lots of places. People throw it around a lot. But why does it even matter to have a whole hour discussing this one topic? So I'll set the stage a bit by telling you a bit of a story. Start where a man called Guillermo Robles sued Domino's Pizza for having a website that was inaccessible to the point where he couldn't order pizza. He is a blind man and he had some specific problems. One, he said that all the images on the site had no alternative text to it, so he couldn't understand what any of them meant, and that there were a lot of links on the site that had no text to give him context of what was happening on the site. So the simple act of just ordering something to eat was impossible for him, and he decided to sue. And when you hear that at face value, it sounds a bit of an overreaction. Like, why would he go all the way to suing a company because he couldn't order some pizza? I mean, he could have just gone to any other company and ordered his pizza and be fine. But when you then think about it, Domino's Pizza was founded in 1960, long before the internet was a thing. And they were catching up with the times. So do many other companies, right? So you really don't know the state of their site at any point in time. Another company, UK Clickaway Pound, in that same year, did a survey and found out that about 4 million people in the world abandon their cart on a retail e-commerce site because of the problems that those sites present them in terms of using the site. And this was the same year that Guillermo sued Domino's. So it wasn't something that was singular to him. It was something that many people in the world were experiencing at the same time. 4 million people at the same time, to be precise. And to put that in context, it was estimated that around 11 billion pounds were lost from those 4 million people each time they decided to leave a site because they couldn't use the site. That study was done in 2016. As of 2019, when the study was conducted a second time, that amount rose from 7 billion to 17 billion, which means more people were beginning to have problems when they try to use different sites. And if you think about the life of someone who is blind, they have limited options by default because of their disability. So imagine when something as little as ordering food to eat becomes a Herculean task that you can't just perform. I'd imagine that he was already frustrated from trying different websites, and that was the camel's back for him. And to be very truthful, if he did not go as far as suing Domino's, and if Domino's did not lose that lawsuit, they wouldn't have gone to fix that site. In fact, that lawsuit was so significant that it served as the very first time that any legal court established that websites and mobile apps fell under the Accessibility Act that was created in the 90s. Prior to that time, no one had ever mentioned that. It should have been a no-brainer, but no company had ever thought that they needed to make their websites as accessible as the spaces which they worked in. So that's why it matters. But let me give you more context. In the world today, 1.3 billion people in the world live with an accessibility with a disability. And that's about 16% of the world's population. If you mix and match countries very well, that's about the population of several countries living with a disability. Now, when we think about disabilities, common things that come to mind are like people in wheelchairs or blind people with canes and that kind of thing. But there are actually way more disabilities in the world than these two things. They're very common, and you're not wrong for thinking those things when you think about a disability. In fact, when I asked ChatGPT to show me someone with a disability with no extra information, several times it showed me someone with a prosthetic leg. So everybody basically thinks the same thing if ChatGPT keeps on giving me the same answer. But there are actually way more disabilities in the world, and having an understanding of just how much variety they are would explain why 1.3 billion people have disabilities. So let's look at different kinds of disabilities. First kind you'd see are permanent disabilities. These are disabilities, long-term, lifelong impairments. There are different types. You'd have visual disability, like the different forms of blindness, auditory disabilities like deafness, motor disabilities like limb amputation, neurological disabilities like cerebral palsy, autism, ADHD, epilepsy, like all those things are considered as disabilities, and there's so many more. You also have temporary disabilities. These are disabilities that are short-term due to illness or injury and would eventually go away with treatment. Like if you have a broken arm, or you just had surgery and you're recovering, or you had a concussion. These are things that they come, they stay for a while, and they go. For that period when you have that disability, you can't really do much of anything, and your life is slightly different for a period of time. But there's a third type of disability, which I'm sure many people might not have considered, and they're called situational disabilities. These are based on context and exist only in that context. An example would be trying to use your mobile phone while holding a baby, or trying to use your mobile phone in bright sunlight. You wouldn't be able to see anything. Or trying to use your phone in a very loud environment. Even if you're trying to listen to an audio tape in a loud environment, you wouldn't hear anything. But then also the loud noise would affect how effective you do certain actions. You could make mistakes. All those things form situational disabilities. Now, we may not fall into the first or the second category of disabilities, but most certainly we fall in the third. In fact, I dare say that in the course of the day today, you have fallen in situational disabilities a couple of times. The first time it occurred to me that situational disabilities are a thing to reckon with was the first time I established why I use dark mode. Many of us are into coding, or we work with screens a lot in this group. So think about it. How many of us in this room use dark mode today, or have the brightness of our screens set to a very low value or switch around with it in the day. I, for one, have every single app that I use on dark mode. So much so that the first time I used an app on light mode, I felt like it was so blinding. It was really painful to use. And that's when I found out how dependent I was on a feature that wasn't really built for me. It was built for people with more visual disabilities. But because of the nature of my job, I have been depending on it for the longest time. So the truth is that accessibility is for everyone. Products benefit everybody, not just people living with disabilities. Now, a study was done quite recently, last year, I believe, and it was very interesting, the results. So they got 66 people who were visually impaired in some way and 65 people with no visual impairment. They gave both groups of people an online shopping site with tasks to perform. They gave them two versions of that site. One version met web accessibility standards to the T, and the other version didn't meet standards. At the end of that study, the results showed that everyone was able to get the task done. There wasn't any significant thing to note in terms of how each set of people used the site. But when they then analyzed the open-ended questions they asked the participants about their experience with the web accessible site, the people with visual disabilities they gave a lot of positive reviews on how good and easy it was for them to use the site. And for the people without any disability, they didn't give so much positive feedback, but then they gave lesser negative feedback than they did before. Now, the reason why this would appear such is that for someone who has been particularly handicapped or has experienced a very bad experience, the moment they meet something better, they would have a lot to say about it. But for people without disabilities, without any visual impairment, both sides would just be normal to them. It would be like a normal, typical day using a site. They would only have anything to say of note if they experienced something bad. So what the study showed was, with the site being more accessible, the people without visual impairments complained even less, which means it served them better, although they didn't know it. And that's why I feel that everybody stands to benefit from accessibility or more accessible products, even if they don't know it. So now let's look at how some small changes in products can vastly affect how people experience those products, especially people with disabilities. First off, let's look at how assistive technologies rely on HTML structure. So here I have two flowcharts, and I'd like to look at how a screen reader would walk through those flowcharts. And for people that don't know, a screen reader is used by people with visual impairments to read through a page. What the screen reader does is it looks at the basic HTML that is compiled after everything, and it reads the elements out and the content in those elements to the listener, and the listener is then able to decide how to click on a page. So they can imagine the page more or less in their heads and then work with the page. There are different kinds of screen readers. Mac has a built-in screen reader called VoiceOver. The equivalent for that in Android is TalkBack, and the equivalent for that in Windows is called Narrator. There are also third-party screen readers that you could use, but these are the major ones that you would hear people talk about. So, because a screen reader depends on the HTML structure of the page and whatever you give it, and it just reads it out as is, the structure of HTML is very important on how a person would eventually understand the page. Now, in the first part of the flowchart, the good HTML structure, the screen reader would go in and read the nav element. It would tell the user that this is a navigation element. And as is expected with most nav elements, you would then have like a list of menu items in that nav element. So it will tell you navigation container, it will go in and it will start telling you navigation menu item 1, 2, 3, 4. It's able to tell you that those are menu items because you gave it the initial context that that was a navigation element to begin with. It will then go on to the next container, which would be the heading. And because it's a H1 tag, it's able to tell the listener that this is a heading level 1. And then it will read the text, which is heading in this case, and so on and so forth. It will just read everything out. But it's able to give you the context of what it is and what the children are. Now, when you have bad HTML structure, what happens is it just reads what it sees, but because it doesn't have that added context, you can't really make sense of it. So for example, say to create the nav element, the developer decided to use a div because we love divs. Divs are the answer to every problem. And we used a div and then we had the menu items in the div. It could look exactly like the first nav element, but because it's just a random div, the screen reader would literally just say container and then go in and read the menu items. It won't tell you that those are menu items because it doesn't even know that there are many items, but it will read it all out to you. So as someone who can't see anything, you hear all these information, but you can't really make sense of what each thing is and make a decision then as to what to click or not click. I think it gets worse with spans because for div, it will tell you it's a container. For a span, it doesn't even tell you that as a span element. It would only read out button and then that's the end of it. So if the text were different and it wasn't button in this case, it was something else, it would sound like it was just a random text written somewhere, not a clickable element. To give it more context, I went out of my way to find a place where a screen reader would not read something correctly. And they're more common than you would think because one thing that happens a lot is when you're using component libraries, you have outsourced the part of making it accessible to the owner of the library. You trust them to have done extensive work to make that component accessible. So you just take that component and you use it in your website, and you expect it to just work out of the box and everything is fine. But most of the time, many component library builders end up doing hacks to make it look pretty, and some of those hacks are not accessible. So right now we're going to look at Material UI's website and see how a screen reader would read some of the elements in the website.
VoiceOver on Chrome. Material UI. You are currently on a link. To click this link, press Control Option Space / Material UI. Clickable. You are currently on a text element. Heading level 1. 5 items. Ready to use. Clickable. Material design. Clickable. Components. Clickable. You are currently on a heading level 1. Material UI is an open source React component library that implements Google's material design. It's comprehensive and can be used in production out of the box. Clickable. You are currently on a selectable text. Visited. Link. Get started. You are currently on a link. To click this link, press Control Option Space. Link. View templates. You are currently on a link. To click this link, press Control Option Space. $npm install add MUI / material add emotion / react add emotion / styled button group. You are currently on a button group. To click this button, press Control Option Space.
Okay, so that was VoiceOver on Mac. It was moving at a very slow pace. I think one fun thing to note here would be an actual blind user or visually impaired user listens to voiceover at 4 times the speed which I'm listening to it now. So I don't even think it's audible at that point in time. But I want you to note when it read the heading, it said heading level 1 and then said 5 items and broke down the sentence into 5 different items and then went on to read the next paragraph underneath in one simple text. So let's have a look at the actual HTML that the screen reader was attempting to read and see what was happening. So for the heading, it read heading level 1, which is expected, but then we can see that the text is broken into pieces. So we have ready to use, and we have a break element. We have a span with material design. We have another break element, and we have components. So when it said 5 items, it's reading each one as a particular item. But for the screen reader, we would love it to just read all together, ready to use material design components. And then we can see for the paragraph underneath, it was, as expected, one paragraph with one continuous line of text. So in a bid to make the page look nice and have the text flow and wrap as expected, they ended up breaking the text in a way that just doesn't make sense for someone with a screen reader anymore. And that's the balance that we're always trying to do as developers, make something look nice, but still be usable for everyone involved. Now let's look at another example of a common malpractice with accessibility. So we have this very simple form. It's fine. Can everybody read what is on this form? Feel free to react and let us know. If you have the full name, you have the field, you have the password, you have the field, seems okay-ish now, but let's look at contrast. Now, contrast basically is, for people that don't know, is just about the difference between colors from background and foreground text. Can you see it? Is it visible to everyone? With good eyesight, this might seem okay. This might seem legible. But from experience, I just know that looking at this, that this might not. Now, every browser has an inbuilt tool in the developer tools, a bit of a contrast checker. And if you can look well, you can see a whole section when you hover over an element, a whole accessibility section that is added there that shows you the name of the element, the role of the element, if it's keyboard focusable, if it has contrast. This is just the basic things there. There are lots of third-party tools and extensions which you can use to test even more. I will share some at the end of the talk. But this already out of the box gives you the basic check that you want to do. And when you look at this, you can see that it has a contrast ratio rating of 2.25. And you can already see the icon, the warning icon there, telling you like, this is not good. Now, contrast ratio ratings, there's a scale. It goes from 0 all the way to a very large number. The larger the number, the better the contrast. So this here is really telling you that this has poor contrast. What this means is that if I find someone with the correct level of color blindness, they would not see that text at all. But then you also need to think about light sensitivity as well. So if I was in a bright enough environment and I looked at this same screen, it would all blend together and I would find it very hard to see it. If I gave someone who was old and had failing eyesight this, they would not see it for the same reason, because the color of the text is very close to the color of the background. When you think about hex values, where F in 6 places is white and 0 in 6 places is black, you look at the color value there, it's already at A, which is getting closer and closer to white. So the further away you can make the color of the text be from the background, the better. So I decided to play around with this and see how can I immediately improve the contrast of this and make this better. And it was quite simple. I just darkened it just a little bit, still on the same spectrum of where it was there. And now you can see the difference. The first image on top is what it was before, and then the second image under is what it is now. It still has the same look and feel that the user intended, but it's just more legible. And when I use developer tools to check what it is now, we can see now that the contrast rating is 4.73. So very small change. And you can see from the color value that I added there that it's not too far from what it was before. But now at least we have a good contrast rating. I can make this contrast rating even better. The darker I make it, I could go as far as just making it black. And then maybe I would have a contrast ratio of 19. But just small changes making the greatest impact for users. And let's look at one more thing. Navigation. Have you ever attempted to use a website without your mouse? I did this one time when I was starting my career. I had this old rickety laptop that was more of a television than a laptop. And one time I had my mouse trackpad was broken completely, and I had no money to take it for it. That was the first time I realized that you should actually be able to navigate everything in your laptop using the keyboard alone with no mouse trackpad. And you would just tab your way through or space through. So you have your tab button, you have your space bar, and you have your enter key, you have arrow up, arrow down. Those things should be enough for you to tab your way through a page. And how the keyboard is able to know what to navigate to, again, relies on the HTML structure of your page. There are some elements that have been clearly defined as keyboard navigable. So if you have an input field, if you have a nav bar, again, if you have labels versus checkboxes and buttons, it knows which elements are for interaction, and then it knows to be able to move to those elements. So if I wanted to do something fancy with my input box, for example, and then I had the input box embedded deeply in a set of divs all through, and I tried to navigate using keyboard, it would just skip that div because a div is not a keyboard navigable element, and it would just skip it all through. So let's look at an example, a very simple example of what happens when I try to use keyboard navigation to go through a page. So first off, when you hover over it in DevTools again, you can see under accessibility, keyboard focusable nav is ticked right there with a check mark. If I go back a few slides and we look at the label before, you can see that it shows that it's not navigable. So that already by default tells you like if you're using the correct element, and it should always be navigable. And if we go through to just look simply how it works, when I tab through, it should go to everything on that page that can be clicked or can be interacted with. And that's simply how keyboard navigation works. To make something navigable is you don't need to do anything beyond using the correct element because it comes out of the box with HTML. And yeah. And that in itself is just some of the little changes that we could do that makes a website usable for everybody. Other things would include adding alternative text to images, which is something that many developers forget to do. Alternative text would simply just describe the image in text, and when a screen reader hits that image, it would read out that text. So it would be a lady sitting under a tree reading a book. And if you can even be more descriptive than that, the more helpful it is. We've seen many applications now bringing in alt text and allowing users to add alt text more. Not too long ago, X added that as a feature where when you post a picture, it gives you the option to add alternative text for that image where you can write whatever you want to. Before that wasn't there, and they would auto-generate a description for the image when you post it. But then giving the user the ability to properly describe their image makes it easier for people to use those things. Now, one common misconception when I talk about accessibility is that it is solely a problem, a web problem. It is solely a front-end developer's problem. And I can see that because the biggest impact will be made by front-end developers on what they decide to do in terms of code. But in truth, accessibility is a problem that affects everybody. And if anyone in the whole cycle of a product's development misses the opportunity of making their part of the problem work, then eventually it will trickle downstream and it will affect everybody. So everyone's responsibility. It's the full stack developer's responsibility. It's the front-end developer's responsibility. It is the back-end developer's responsibility. Quality assurance would make sure that everything meets up to accessibility standards. Design is one of the first places where they can decide how some of these things would look like, how coloring would look like, how placement would look like. Product managers would also help to prioritize some of these features that need to be accessible, prioritize testing these features that need to be accessible. But together, we all make products accessible. So for backend and full stack, which are places you wouldn't normally think about accessibility, there are some ways that they can help. For one, API responses. So when you call an API, how the data is structured determines how much work the front end needs to do to show that information or not. If you make it hard for the front end to show that information and they have to do more work to show that information, that could impact how that information is shown to the user. An example would be sending a string when you don't need a string, and then the front end has to always do that conversion from string to object or objects to string to show that data. You want to make sure that the front end does as little processing as possible and just does the barest minimum: gather data from the user, send it back, receive data, just show it to the user. So how difficult or how simple an API looks determines the experience that a user would have on a site. And I normally advocate for front-end developers coming early into a system design process to be part of that process of defining a contract for an API. Because you are the ultimate consumer of that API, you should decide what that API would look like. In the course of my work, I found myself doing that more and more, coming into the system design process and making sure that I advocate for the end customer while they're designing those things. Another instance is error handling. So if a call fails, how do we fail gracefully? How do we fail in such a way that still makes sense for the user or doesn't completely cut off the user from the operations that they were doing? How can we still allow them to do the next best thing there? What kind of error messages are we showing the user? Do those error messages make sense? When a wonderful example of this would be many sites using JavaScript, we perform server-side rendering a lot, where we render half of the page server-side and then we offer it to the user. What happens when you're rendering those pages server-side? If there's an error while rendering those pages server-side, the accessibility guidelines demands that there is a fallback. in whatever experience you're rendering. So you want to do some fancy new design or some fancy new interaction, that is fine. But in a situation where they cannot use that interaction, or it's not optimized for them, there should always be a fallback, something that they can make do with. And it doesn't have to be fancy. It can be the simplest of solutions. Just write it out there, but it has to be sensible to whoever reads it. Next up is data handling. And when you think of data handling, one thing I point out is, what language do you use to describe the things that you're doing? Is the language sensible to everybody? When you're writing documentation, for example, is it easy to understand? You have out of the box so many things to consider. The fact that your users live in different places, speak different languages, is it understandable to them in those languages? Now, we always tend to leave the job to localization on the front end again, but how you store that data in databases also affects how much localization can do. Are you storing that data in a format that makes it easy to translate for different people? The data itself, also the text, is it sensible? Like there's a whole guide on plain English, as it's called, on how to write to make it understandable, for people. These are little things that we tend to overlook, but if done terribly, it would be very noticeable on a site. And then the last thing, which is like the no-brainer thing, performance. How fast is your site? How slow is your site? A common example that I always like to remind developers of is like, when you work in companies now, you start your job and you're issued a device to use to do your job. Most times that device would be a MacBook Pro on the highest level of performance, because you need a lot of power to do your work. Not everyone is as privileged to use such devices as you. Not everyone lives in places with internet connections. Some people are still running on 3G. Some people have network that throttles. Some people pay a hefty amount of money to get internet connectivity and will experience the same websites that you built in a totally different manner. They might not be disabled, but they are still having different experiences. But then when you start thinking about people with disabilities, many of them have spent a hefty amount to even get those tools that they use to manage themselves. When you think of people on electric wheelchairs, or that have voice synthesizers and things like that, they don't have the means to constantly update their tools as new tech comes out. So sometimes it's a case of, if it's not broken, don't fix it. And they will use that one tool that they have consistently. It is your job to make sure that whatever you build is backward compatible, and not only functions, but functions well enough for them. Recently, I came across a customer who said she couldn't use our website and couldn't get past a particular page. And it was really hard for us to understand what was wrong, till finally we had to get on a call with her and tell her to show us her setup. Now, it was very old, and she was using a browser that I had never heard before in my life, called Lynx browser. That day was the first day I had used it. And when I opened up the browser to understand what it is, it was basically command line, but it was a browser, but it just had a command line interface and read everything in that manner. And our website didn't work well because we used a lot of JavaScript, which it wasn't processing, and that was the problem. So we were then left with the problem of either making changing the website to make JavaScript work on the browser, or just making a fallback that she could use. And there are many instances of where that happens, where you end up omitting certain sectors of people because of performance, and then they have bad performance. The truth is that There are so many different kinds of browsers, so many cases to cover that in truth you cannot cover all. But if you are aware that you need to cover as much as possible, you can provide a very simple fallback that would cover as much as possible. Many websites and companies end up having a supported statement where they list out the browsers that are supported, that they support. And then people who do not support that browser, they tell them clearly, like, this is the experience that you will get. But then that transparency saves users a lot of time, and they're able to either keep on in the site or just divert to something else. But yeah, those are just a few ways that backend and full stack developers can help improve accessibility in the course of their work. But yeah, down to the key thing that I wanted everyone to take away. Now, working on accessibility, I believe, makes you a wonderful developer, and I see it as a superpower to be able to think in accessibility. It is something that I have seen make me a better developer. It's something I have seen people give feedback about, but not directly. They never know that it's accessibility that makes me good at what I do, but I have drawn the lines. So I just want to explain why it makes you a better developer. So the first thing is it makes you by default design better experiences for people. I've had times where I am advocating for users and saying, before the user even touches the product, like, I can say for certain that this experience will be terrible for them, or this experience will be wonderful for them, where I'm advocating right from the point of where APIs are being designed, that you have to design the API in this manner, because if you don't, this is what will happen for the user. And this I have noticed from my days in designing, in doing product design and designing screens, and that has translated to my work as a developer. Yeah, Damola.
Yeah, we have few minutes left,
Cool,
so
cool,
if we can,
cool, I will. And then also, apart from that, it also means that you write better code out of the box. So things like ARIA labels, using the correct HTML tag and everything, it comes to you naturally. You don't have to write code and then have to go through a massive review before you get it right. You get it right the first time because you're thinking about these things subconsciously as well. But then it also means that you design things inclusively by default. You're always thinking about a broader range of people by default. And more likely, when you do something, the final product is something that many people will be happy with immediately, which will save whatever company you're working with a lot of money down the line when they don't have to go through massive audits to fix things later. And it gives you more career opportunities. You can decide to have a more hybrid role as a UX designer or a product engineer like myself, where you're doing product work, but you're also doing engineering. You can also go into more niche careers, or like an accessibility engineer, where you're focusing wholly on accessibility and just working to make things better for companies, which is a role that is beginning to gain traction as more laws are coming into place for accessibility. So to summarize, the things that you can do today: 1, test a site with a screen reader. It can be any page. It can be your company site. It can be a random page there. Just play around with the screen reader and see how it works and see common things that happen. Second thing you can do is test color contrast on your project. You can use the default tool on your browser, or you could use any other third-party tool. You can run a lighthouse test as well. That is something that has some feedback to give you. And 3, in the course of your work, improve one accessibility feature a week. It is work that you might not get praises for immediately, but it is something that will make you feel proud of yourself as a developer. And when people eventually start having better experiences from using the product you built. They might not clock it, but it might be the work that you've done improving it. So I will end with this one quote. The web is for everyone, and let us build it that way. Thank you. And you can find me on LinkedIn, you're on X, and you want to hear me rant once in a while about this stuff and other things, you can also find me there as well.
Yeah, that was amazing, Linda. Thanks so much. You just like went on the point, like so many like details, so many like important topics that possibly we never like noticed that before, and it's so important. Like, yeah, it was amazing. Thank you so much. So yeah, if you guys want Linda LinkedIn is pin as well, like the Mola and myself. We also have like a feedback form. If you can just fill out, because will help us with the next events, will be great. And I guess we are ready for the questions, right, Damola?
Yeah.
We have a couple of questions. Again, nice presentation, Linda. It was really eye-opening. So quick one. Nice. Okay, the first question is, can we rely on AXCore package to detect problems with the keyboard accessible tags or accessibility issue in general in the code? Or do you have any other recommendation, please?
AXCore is a very good tool to use. It was built by DQ, which are an authority in the accessibility world. They're part of the people who work on designing the standard that the world uses. So AXCore is a very good one. I think from all my tests I've done, it's the best there is. So you can start there, and then just keep on trying other ones. If I ever see one that is better than Axe, I will post it in the community.
Cool. I missed this. Do you maybe have any recommendation resources of good practice?
The best recommendation I would give is the accessibility guidelines themselves. Try to go through them because they're very, very descriptive in what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. Knowing that at the back of your mind helps you to go in. So for me, normally I look through the guidelines, I see some things there, I start looking for examples of websites that do those things well, and then I learn from them.
If you can share the link, maybe it will be helpful for them. And then Nessa said, I'm editing my website right now. A couple of links on that background didn't have enough contrast with an almost imperceptible change. Now they do. Nice one. Yeah. Is there any guide or standard set about accessibility features to include to websites?
Yes.
Or
So the standard is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. I will share the link after. It is the international standard used. For the Domino's case I mentioned earlier, they were judged on those same guidelines. So if you don't adhere to them, you could get sued. So
yeah. And then my question is how I can get my colleagues to care since we are not customer facing and they are not coders or programmers. Even though we have multiple colorblind people, I am having real trouble getting it through to them to use colorblind accessible palettes, even in Excel and PowerPoint. Any idea or advice?
wonderful. So this is very similar to the situation I face at my office. The products I work on are more internal facing than anything. And one thing that I do is work a lot with your HR team or people team, because already they should be doing some work to make the workplace conducive for everyone, which includes those colorblind people in the office. So if you work with them and you're able to help them say, like, I have this solution that would make this solution much more usable for these people that are colorblind, they would be able to help you to enforce it. Sometimes I default to just telling people it's the law. Like, if you won't have empathy, then you will obey the law. and law is that you have to do this. So it's a continuous process. There are lots of things that could be done. I am currently also going through a process where I'm trying to educate everybody in the company about accessibility. I created a course that lets people know, like, in your role, this is what you can do. In your role, this is what you can do, while still tagging it underneath, it is the law. So, so yeah, you can try that.
Yep. And then what is designer role in making a product accessible apart from making things have enough contrast? Or is this more of a developer responsibility in general?
A designer can do many things.
Yeah,
So
I agree.
when you design a screen, you put images, you can tell the developer during handoff, these are the things I want the alt text to be. You can also, in terms of when designing things, there's such a thing as a person's mental model, which is how a person perceives a page. It is up to you, the designer, to also think about, like, how you want people to perceive a page. In places where you think that there has to be a fallback, you can decide what that fallback needs to be. Currently, what happens a lot is that a designer hands over design to developer. They don't state many things out clearly. The developer builds what is there, and then for the remaining things, they just guess and put things there. They might do it with the best intentions, but it might not have the desired result. So if you want more control in how the final experience would be very, very clear on what you want at every step. Put it as little notes in the Figma doc, and they will read it and they will implement it.
Yep. And then there was, thank you so much for this session. It's been very useful. I would love to get the link to your course. My question is, how do you add accessibility to applications that use large learning models like Cursor, ChatGPT, API?
So that is quite new, a new field of study, because AI is just being developed in general. But right now, the easiest thing to think of is, like, right now, ChatGPT is being inserted into spaces that already exist. So you're using a ChatGPT API in a Web 2 space. So it's still something that is visual, it's still something that is audio. You can't really predict what the output of those large language learning models are, but you can predict the format in which the output would be shown. So if it's audio, if it's video, think about how people will take in that response, and then just make sure that it's easy to take in different formats. That might just be the first thing that you would do. If it, as things improve and we go into, like, other areas such as AR or VR, then we can start thinking of, like, more things to do. But one thing I've seen is that the basic thing of just visual, audio, those things we haven't met up with yet, so we don't need to think further.
Ah,
I saw something about laws. So the laws, I want to mention all the countries. So USA, UK, Japan, Australia, all of the EU, India, and for the EU, by June, and I see someone said that this year, there's the EAA laws coming in by June that mandates every individual member of the EU to create more stringent laws for accessibility. That is going to be a big thing to come, because that means every single state is going to have their own interpretation of what they need companies to do to be accessible. But a key thing that those laws will state is that they demand that every company has to report what they're doing for accessibility and how far they've gone, which means if you are not accessible or you're not at the highest level of accessibility standards, you need to report yourself, else you could get fined. And the fine is way much bigger than it was before. So something to note.
something to let your company know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. I do know I don't know in Slovenia, all websites connected to public offices need to have this, but I have not seen much here in the UK. At least no pop-up when you visit an official page. Yeah.
Yeah, there's no pop-up, yes, but the UK actually does a lot to help accessibility. They have a whole section in the uk.gov site dedicated to accessibility. In fact, I think in I can't remember, 2019, 2020, they used to run like empathy labs that anybody in the country could join, where they would run you through accessibility scenarios and everything. But they have a very big section on accessibility, and they're very accessible.
Yeah. I think, yeah, it was just a comment on your answer. If you would like to share the link on some recommendation on Slack, you can also send it here via chat.
Yeah.
We are out of time, but I would like to say thank you so much, Linda, for this eye-opening presentation. Thank you, Joanna, for co-hosting. Thank you, everyone.